So let me start by thanking Paolo, Sara, Aurora and Alejandro for organizing this event and for inviting us all into the exciting discussions about home and homing. I thought yesterday was an amazing day. It was very dense, very thought-provoking, valuable reflections. It was very packed, and I was hoping that I could make more reference to it today, but I'm not sure, after the nice dinner yesterday and everything, that I'm able to put it all in reference. But I hope that I will speak to a lot of what was said yesterday and also what will come today. The presentation today I've titled Mobility, Informality and the Material, Conceiving Home in Unending Displacement. And in a way, the presentation is both work in progress, but also work that I have been working on for many years. It's thoughts that I'm, together with many different colleagues, developing every day. I've just come back from 2 weeks of fieldwork in Lebanon, together with my center colleague, Brigitte Picard, and 5 students. And I'm quite overwhelmed at the moment with new material, new data, and I think you all know that feeling when you just come back from fieldwork and you just want to talk about everything that you've experienced in the field. So I'll try to weave in, particularly at the end, some of the perspectives from Lebanon. A lot of my work has been about homemaking in exile. I work with both internally displaced persons, people who are displaced within the country that they're often still citizens of, and also refugees. I kind of assume that you know a little bit about those categories. I'm not going to explain a lot about the sort of context of refugees and internally displaced persons in this presentation. So if you need more background to that, let's come back to that in the discussion. What I want to do is to maybe take a little bit of a step back and look at some of the ways in which I think that forced migration studies and migration studies more general could perhaps talk more to each other. And I want to talk more about the particular issue of politics of home and the sort of status and legality and institutionalization of refugees and displaced persons and how that affects relations to home. So, home, I have argued with my good colleague Anita Fabos, is a possible lens through which we can productively think and find solutions to people's forced movement. Understanding the lives of refugees and internally displaced persons through a lens of home enables an emphasis on people's experience and reality, on what people do, how people maneuver their day-to-day restrictions, and as a result, it can be helpful in unpacking the opportunities that people have in exile. In our work, and in line with a number of other scholars, we have argued for engaging with the multiscalar notion of home, where home ranges from a lower capital home for everyday and day-to-day activities, via home with the uppercase H, which concerns the identity and community, to a fully uppercase home, which concerns the geopolitical and legal status of people's right to a home. So this constellation of home, home and home, I will talk more about later to explain how we can work on a home and mobilized home for forced migration in unending situations of displacement. We have suggested that mobilizing home in this way could be a more productive way of understanding solutions for forced migrants in the current global refugee situation. And I'll explain this proposition in a talk. What I'm particularly concerned with in this talk then is how home can be mobilized in what we call unending displacement, or long-term displacement, or protracted displacement, which is often the policy term. The refugee status was constructed as a temporary status, but generally lasts for 5, 10, 20 or more years. I read somewhere that the average length of displacement is more than 17 years. And I'm not referring to these as fixed numbers, but I think it's quite important to realize that once you are displaced, your displacement might last for 17 years as an average, which is quite a lot of time. There is a reluctance, however, on the part of national and international actors to solve the various displacement crises that have become a symptom of our time. These are crises that are not inevitable, but result from political action and inaction. National governments and humanitarian actors continue to relate to three durable solutions: return to the place of origin, resettlement to the third country, and local integration. But currently, none of these solutions are very viable. As long as wars are ongoing, people cannot return. Less than 1% of the world's refugees are resettled to a third country every year. And when it comes to local integration, this is only partly a solution for many refugees due to the unavailability of becoming full citizens or gain rights on a par with more established groups in a particular nation state. As I will show in this talk, what we are witnessing today is what Anita Fabos and I call integration light. It is only partly integration that is available to many refugees around the world. So the majority of refugees today are believed to live outside camps. They live with family and friends in rented dwelling or in semi-organized residences, such as squats and other more communal spaces, often located in urban areas. They're frequently less visible than people in organized settlements, often not living in the place where they first registered as displaced or refugees, if they registered at all, and they often have less access to assistance and protection. Displaced people outside camps represent a heterogeneous group about whom we know much less than we do about the paradigmatic victim of the encamped refugee. The problem is that the humanitarian community continue to address refugees as a temporary phenomenon, which leads to what I've shown elsewhere, that people feel stuck, unable to move on with their lives. But we need to realize that this phenomenon will persist. We know that still, with this troubled status, people struggle to find home and make home. More is needed to understand these processes and to recognize the experiences and practices of homemaking that take place in exile in order to change current policies. So what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is to explain our notion with Anita Fabos on constellations of home. I will then talk about three inspirations when we talk about refugees and displaced people, in particular outside camps: mobility, informality, and materiality. I will engage a little bit, if I had more time I would talk more about it, but a little bit with feminist critique of home and the notion of leaving home. And then I would move into a discussion about how we can understand a political home and engage in relation to that with the notion of recognition before I try to explain some of these big debates into the situation of Georgian IDPs and Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So, with inspiration from Alison Blunt and Robin Dowling's work on critical geographies of home and many others who have worked on the multiscalarity of home, Anita and I have developed a conceptual framework that addresses the static fixity of the contemporary forced migration system, the mobility of people's strategies, and the daily practices and struggles of people's lives in exile. We wanted to include the messiness, the inequalities that people face and negotiate, as well as the nostalgia and the romantic notions that people bring with them when they're making home in exile. So all the three strands come together in people's everyday practices in exile. The framework helps to explore home both as an idea and a practice, distinguishing among three elements. Home, with lowercase letters, is the day-to-day practices that help to create the place of displacement as a particularly significant kind of place. Home, with uppercase H, is more circled around the cultural values, traditions, memories, subjective feelings, and sense of community, often concerning an ideal home. And home, with uppercase letters, we understand as the geopolitics of nation and homeland, the broader and political historical context in which the optic of protracted refugee situations and durable solutions have developed. It gives visibility to the policy assumptions about displaced people in a largely fixed global order. So Anita's sister has made a model for us. I need to go to... So the framework helps us to understand how persons displaced in protracted circumstances produce different strategies of making home in the liminal circumstances specific to each interrelationship between the three meanings of home. It's a three-dimensional idea of a constellation of connected modes of home. When viewed from different angles, it gives prominence to one mode over the other. So in some situations, for example, if the mouse works, which it doesn't, oh, there it is. It might be this notion of home that feels the most important for the refugees in the situation that we are studying. So, thinking about home as a constellation, it involves understanding also how different understandings of home can change over time and in different circumstances within a particular refugee situation. It also, as I will suggest here, can help us to understand how we can engage with processes of disempowerment and empowerment in exile. So we propose mobilizing home as an alternative solution for long-term displacement. So in order to discuss home in protracted displacement, we also need to move a little bit towards different discourses that have engaged with home in different ways. And working in the field of long-term displacement but outside camps and institutionalized settings, there are particularly three discourses that I would like to engage with here: mobility, informality, and materiality. So when it comes to mobility, home and mobility has been, I think, the most productive interaction of work to nuance and develop studies of home. I think yesterday and probably today really shows that. It's in that field between home and mobility that we see a lot of the new understandings of home emerging. And Sara Ahmed's understanding of leaving home produces many homes is testament, I think, to the ways in which home has become to be understood as a multiscalar and translocal issue. The body of literature on home and migration that concerns diaspora, culture and movement, however, also produces romantic notions of home and presumes previous access to full citizenship. Relevant for the study of home and long-term displacement is the call for more sophisticated understandings of power in studies of mobility that can be linked to questioning the relationship between mobility and immobility for making home and displacement. And this is closely linked to the notions of nomadic and monadic, and the notions of becoming and the sort of dynamics and transformation that is all often linked directly to mobility. So a critique of mobility has then been a tendency for existing mobilities research to draw a connection between mobility, autonomy and freedom. But refugees and internally displaced persons, once displaced, are often depicted in, but also, as I argue later, institutionalized state of immobility and passivity. So although forced migrants are able to move, they're all often sort of understood as passive and inactive and immobile once they have become displaced persons. The second discourse is around informality. And the majority of refugees and displaced people living outside camps are believed to live in cities, and they often lead informal lives in a number of different ways. They may work informally or illegally, they may live in an informal settlement or rent on the informal housing market. Informality in this sense may often be understood as a governmental tool. Some activities and groups of people are assigned an informal status. In the case of refugees and people demarcated as out of place, the informal status comes out of the fact that they are not given the right to work, own property, or run businesses, for example, such as has been the case with Palestinian and Syrian refugees more lately in Lebanon for decades. Informality is a crucial resource for receiving refugees. In Lebanon, Mona Fawaz has shown how informal housing has absorbed a very high number of refugees that arrive in urban areas. It would have been impossible to accommodate the number of refugees in Lebanon without this absorption capacity. There are refugees relative to Lebanese in Lebanon is about 1 to 4, which is one of the highest proportions in the world, I think. Research from African cities by Lauren Landau and colleagues shows that there is not a clear-cut picture of vulnerability when it comes to refugees in urban areas, compared with other migrants in the city. However, those leading informal lives or practicing informality may experience particular forms of precarity and vulnerability. Often it is more difficult for refugees outside camps to access assistance. They are more visible and less targeted for assistance. There is also less resources often to assist people outside camps. Sometimes refugees in urban areas may be better protected when they take the matter in their own hands, rather than relying on the refugee system that is not able to ensure their protection in terms of physical safety, economic security, and tenure security. There has been a tendency, however, in some scholarship to celebrate the informal as transformational. Being on the margins can be understood as nomadic. It's an in-between state of becoming that often symbolizes resistance. But as Anvarli has shown, just as the informal is present in elite spaces, so too is the law present in informal spaces. Illegal settlements processes are conditioned by the law. For refugees, informality and lack of legal status that enables people to work and develop their lives create a particular form of glass ceiling. People can only develop their lives so much, as Jeff Crisp has pointed out. So while informality by some has been celebrated as a potential for migrants, not only as a means for survival, but also to resist and find a place and claim the right to the city, Anvarli shows how social practices are also shaped by participants' perception of that legal situation, where people wish for more formalized status, and in her case, want, for example, ownership to their dwelling and more security through that formalization. And that brings me over to the role of the materiality of homemaking in exile. This field has also attracted some attention, but I would also say is still quite under-researched, although there were some great papers yesterday in the materiality session on this. But when it comes to refugees and displaced people, for many years it was almost assumed that materiality wasn't very relevant because of what people didn't bring with them, almost, as David Parkin stated. I want to bring in a study from migration and material culture here. Georgi and Fasulo, in a beautiful article published in Home Cultures in 2013, provides a strong case for reinstating the role of the material into the study of home. They show that there is a need to incorporate an experience of locality in which both representational and embodied processes of homemaking are included. This, they and others argue, then needs to incorporate material culture. And I think with this it is hard to disagree. Giorgio and Fasulo provide the story of homemaking of the Bodus family, a Moroccan household in Rome, Italy, where we are. They have followed the family closely and analyzed their occupation and appropriation of a squat that they share with other migrant families. The article provides a very strong and valuable insight into the homemaking practices at many different levels, and it shows how it enables agency, which is analyzed through the ways in which the household performs homemaking practices in both representational and more material ways. But only in the final paragraph before the conclusion do they mention the following. The possibility of eviction is always present. Samia has given a box full of her most cherished books to a friend who lives in the real house, not threatened by dislocation. So if we look at the study of mobility, of informality, and the material together, I find that there is a real missing link that we need to engage with more in studies of home. This is the governing status, or the institutional and legal statuses that people experience as displaced people and as refugees, which ultimately, I think, impact on the level of protection that people can find. So I want to really come back to this understanding of access to safety and security that very much is linked with the uppercase home that I was talking about earlier. It represents the ways in which forced migrants are implicated with the societies in which they are present, and the particular restrictions that many forced migrants face in trying to make home in exile. And there is a very interesting, I think, link between these three discussions and previous critique from feminist studies about home. The idea of home has been deeply controversial for feminist scholars, and I am very inspired by this work. So it's not just a critique, but I'm also trying to engage with some of these discussions. I think, as I said, the discussions from above on mobility, informality, and material culture really come together in some of the feminist scholarship concerning home. The feminist critique of home took as its starting point the private world of the home as difficult, dangerous, normatively and practically problematic places. Feminists, as we know, argued that we need to leave our intellectual, personal and cultural homes to live on the margin as eccentric subjects or nomads and reject the ideal of safety which a normative home promises. It is again a celebration of the nomadic and in effect the in-between spaces, the status on the margins, that can create transformation and change, and from where we can resist. But the question is, can we simply leave home? And can we create change from those margins? Going back to Sara Ahmed's notion that leaving home produces many homes, it implicates that the one thing that home cannot do is to be left entirely behind. We take with us, I think, memories and particular understandings of home, and we make home in exile in multiple ways. It seems that we just cannot escape home, even the most problematic and troubling aspects of home. So Iris Marion Young, who inspires me, and I'm sure many of you, suggested that we can recover a normative understanding of home by generating 4 normative values of home: safety, individuation, privacy, and preservation. She argued that while politics should not succumb to longing for comfort and unity, the material values of home can nevertheless provide leverage for radical social critique. In Alison Ware's words, this can potentially help us to move beyond the dichotomy of home, not home, of safety and risk. She suggests the possibility of an alternative, a political home, and that this alternative political home is the way to go to engage with home. Ware's concept of political home is self-reflexive, and I want to continue by reflecting more on what a political home may mean in the context of long-term displacement. So, home is always political, and as Paolo has stated in his book, home as a place and an experience of it has meaningful political implications, since it embodies the material and legal boundary between insiders and outsiders. So in Paolo's excellent book, I hope you have all read it and bought it, perhaps I should say as well, the political dimension are described along the following headlines: the needs and aspirations of new and better homes, whether achieved or not, which drive migrant life trajectories; the metaphorical conflation between home and homeland, the nation or the state, which pervade the public discourse of receiving societies vis-à-vis immigrants and their descendants; and finally, the mixed significance of home as a discursive and emotional resource in migration-related forms of political mobilization and claims-making. In this sense, as Paolo states, home is the deep-rooted and institutional marker of the boundaries of legitimate membership and belonging. I would like to take one step back and explore what a political home may mean and how mobilizing home can be transformational in dialogue with Paolo's political issues of home that to some extent can be read in correspondence with our constellations of home. So what could the political home mean in this context? My starting point and inspiration is Louise McNay's critique of normative radical political theory, such as Habermas, Jean-Paul Montfrancière, Brown and others, for being too abstract and to deal with a simplistic understanding of political agency. In her book, The Misguided Search for the Political, Louise McNay criticizes the problematic abstract turn that normative political theory has taken. She criticizes the ways in which we engage with the political in isolation from other areas of social life, a withdrawal from the complexities and messiness of social realms. So with Bourdieu, McNay calls this a misguided attempt, a social weightlessness mode of thought that is so far removed from the actual practices and dynamics of everyday life that ultimately its own analytical relevance and normative validity is thrown into question. McNay proposes a starting point in embedded agency, focusing on the lived realities of oppression and social suffering. She takes her starting point in the fact that the disempowering effect of prolonged inequality may mean that individuals do not feel able to shape their lives in ways that might overturn some of its more intolerable aspects. Often, it may be felt that the only option is to endure to make the best out of a bad situation. This, and I want to be very clear on this is not a way to reduce individuals to passive victims without any agency, but individuals' ability to shape one's conditions of existence is far from straightforward. So, as Louise McNay says, when asymmetrical relations of power are internalized, they may be realized as subjective feelings of powerlessness, despair, and resignation. In a way, it is a simple proposition that brings back the experience of disempowerment that people feel in the institutional structures that they are implicated in. A dimension often, I think, overlooked by theoretical theorists, but I also think is overlooked in some of the studies of home that we have seen here, but also that we have seen throughout the last 20 years of literature on home and homemaking. So from my research on refugees, what I would like to propose is a focus on embedded agency that Louise McNay suggests, that takes as its starting point the personal injustices which impose deeply felt constraints upon people's attempt to seeking home. We cannot overlook those institutional constraints. However, some of these constraints and injustices are very much lacking in the literature on home, some which I just say. And it's also, I think, very much lacking in the perspectives that inspire our understanding of home from mobility, informality, and the material, as I was just discussing earlier. So, in order to understand this political home, I'm increasingly using the lens of recognition. Recognition engages with a multiplicity of scales and concerns people's identity and societal status. I've been working with this discussion with probably some of you have done as well, between Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser on the meaning of recognition. And I think this provides an example of how recognition may be engaged with at different scales. Honneth and Fraser see their models as irreconcilable. But I still find it useful to consider the two models together. Axel Honneth considers recognition as key to specifying the conditions under which human beings can form an identity. He focuses on three modes of recognition: the private sphere, the legal sphere, and the sphere of achievement. In his understanding, it is through these spheres that an individual's self-confidence and sense of membership in the community is established. In the private sphere, Honneth describes recognition as the emotional ties that are developed in families and among friends, where people acknowledge each other with special feelings of appreciation. The sphere of achievement represents social acceptance, even acceptance of unconventional lifestyles. It's a form of solidarity experienced between members of a society. In the legal sphere, recognition takes place when individuals see themselves as sharing the same legal rights as all other members in their community. I think a lot of the research on home considers all these spheres of recognition. However, as Honneth has admitted himself, his model does not outline an institutional framework in which these forms of recognition may be realized, and which is required for an understanding of political home. Here, Nancy Fraser's status model of recognition becomes useful. Fraser emphasizes an understanding of recognition that helps to reintroduce redistribution as an important dimension of the struggle for recognition. Redistribution is related to socio-economic injustices such as exploitation, economic marginalization, and being deprived of an adequate material standard of living. According to Fraser, misrecognition takes place when institutions structure interaction according to cultural norms that impede parity of participation. Examples of such institutional practices might include the ways in which mobile populations are treated in a society, or property laws and social welfare policies that stigmatize certain groups in society. The aims of the status model of recognition is to establish the subordinated party as a full partner in social life, able to interact with others as peers. So I think the lens of recognition is helpful for understanding the constellations of home. And as Anita and I have argued, the constellation of home is a flexible framework where in any given context, the three dimensions or scales of home can be given different weight according to how forced migrants experience and negotiate them. The legal sphere of recognition must be understood in connection with how institutional frameworks for realizing them are put in place. So I want to try to show this and illustrate it through two examples: the experience of internally displaced people who are renting their dwellings in Georgia and Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So let's move to Georgia in the South Caucasus, a former Soviet republic. And again, I could talk a lot about the context of Georgia, but I don't really have time, so if you want to know more, I can also elaborate more later on. And this section is based on my article Dwelling in the Temporary, published in Cultural Studies in 2015, so the quotes are all from that paper. In this paper, I analyzed the situation for internally displaced people displaced from Abkhazia in the 1990s and living as internally displaced in Georgia ever since. Nearly half of the around 250,000 displaced were renting their dwelling with very low tenure security and consequently limited possibilities of homemaking at various scales. Compared to displaced in more institutionalized living arrangements, such as collective centers, they were not registered as displaced where they lived, and their access to assistance that came with the IDP status was often challenging to obtain. The IDPs are citizens in the country where they reside, but due to their humanitarian and highly politicized status as displaced, they experience misrecognition from the larger society in many ways and also through their dwelling. The internally displaced who are renting are living the tension between mobility and immobility. Longing for a position in society where they could control their mobility and achieve stillness was often expressed very much through the interviews that I've done with people there. The socioeconomic status that accompanied their displacement status largely determined their control over mobility and tenure of security. And the celebration of the nomadic, the fluid, and living on the margins was not at all shared by the IDPs in Georgia, who clearly expresses how their experience led to non-recognition. So Monica, who came to Tbilisi to work in a factory when she was 17 and has since lived in somewhere between 10 and 15 places since she arrived in 1999, says that everyone here knows that we are renting. They know that today or tomorrow we will be leaving. Neighbors are only considering us to be here for a short time. So people's deterritorialization does not necessarily lead to re-territorialization. But moving towards a new territory corresponds very often to a process of increasingly precarious territorial constructs. So Dato then continues. It is difficult to change places so often and adapt to new places. After living there for 2 or 3 years, I have become used to a place. But when I'm just about to get used to a place, I have to move again and have to re-establish again. Since I left Abkhazia, I do not move homes, I just move houses. So that gave me an opportunity to ask him, so what does home mean to you, or what is home to you? It is the place where there is a house that belongs to you. You decorate it as you want. You live there for as long as you can get adjusted to the environment and to the space. It's not just a house. It encompasses a neighborhood, the people you learn to know, and then you become familiar. It's the surroundings in general. A home is much more than a house, in my view. So another interviewee who had had a very interesting movement story and who had displaced to Russia and then come back and become an IDP in Georgia, who was in a similar situation, said, "I always have to reinvent myself when I move to a new place." So the two forms of recognition from Honneth and Fraser, identity and status, very much come together in the dwelling arrangement. The dwelling constitutes and symbolizes the personal, the social and the legal. Misrecognition is experienced as a depreciation of one's identity and status by the surroundings. How people make sense of the world is then intimately related to how people are recognized in society. So for the Georgian IDPs, through their double temporal status of being displaced and having a precarious and very low tenure security, they do not feel that they can become part of the society. So let's move on to Lebanon. And as I said earlier, my reflections here is from first exploratory 2-week fieldwork for a project on refugees in fragmented towns and cities from about 2 weeks ago. So it's very fresh and I haven't really processed a lot of the information. We work in the southern town of Saida and around the town with a Lebanese NGO called Blue Mission, who was established to assist Palestinian refugees some years back. In Lebanon, due to the influx of Syrian refugees from the war that started in March 2011, there has been a need for several hundred thousands of housing units that has to be provided in the course of a very short time span. And the town and the surroundings of Saida has taken their part of hosting refugees in that way. UNHCR's shelter service show that throughout Lebanon, refugees access housing mainly through rent. So, as I said earlier, the informal housing sector has managed to absorb the Syrian refugees by increasing the number of housing units. So you have 2 3-bedroom apartments that are divided into 1-room residential units with ad hoc kitchen and bathroom facilities, for example. You have houses with added rooms on the roofs, which is quite common. So the expansion of housing units that's been possible is quite amazing. So this is also very much linked to, I think, how informal networks of social relations and solidarities have proved very efficient and responsive and reliable in providing otherwise unavailable security nets for a number of refugees looking for shelter in the cities. But this is not coming without costs. And the costs are carried by both refugees and non-displaced populations in the towns and cities of Lebanon. Crowding, density, low quality, unhealthy conditions are often the consequences and costs of finding a place to live. And I think it's very important that this is not just about the Syrian refugees, but it's also about how the Palestinian refugees who have been there for many years feel marginalized and not recognized, together with a lot of other groups, particularly what is now called and labeled vulnerable Lebanese, who also feel that they are not getting much assistance, but they take some of the costs of the current Syrian refugee crisis. For those people who are renting, it's not common to have a contract, tenure security is low, and regular movement between residential spaces, as we also saw in the Georgian case, is also common. So, with reference to the Middle East, Bayat describes informality as the quiet encroachment of the ordinary, referring to the non-collective but prolonged direct action by individuals and families to acquire the basic necessities of life in a quiet and unassuming yet illegal fashion. So in the context of Lebanon, Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees before them are treated as foreigners who do not have the right to work in high-skilled employment, who cannot own property and who cannot own businesses. The host fatigue has also seen an increase in harassment in many towns and cities, and it's also been introduced a curfew towards Syrian refugees and other foreigners in many towns, where Syrians are not allowed to go out after 7 o'clock, for example. So many Syrian refugees do not feel very welcome in the neighborhoods where they live. If they are registered as refugees, they might have the right to receive cash assistance, which coming nowhere near what they need to survive. But many of them are not registered, and many of them just really live on the margins. Because they're not allowed to work, they work illegally in casual employment. They're often subject to exploitation, and there's very irregular income that they can experience. One particular shelter where we worked with Blue Mission, the Tipsy Shelter, which everyone said was an old Pepsi factory, but I think in fact it must have been an old storage for Pepsi at the outskirts of Saida. And people have transformed garages and storage in the basement to living spaces, mainly without any natural light or ventilation. And people live here with a monthly rent of about $200 to $300 depending on the space that they have. We found it really difficult to accept that people have to pay rent for these kinds of spaces. The building was negotiated for rent by the UNHCR, and the organization helped to clear out the garbage of the building before people moved in. There are some flats at the top of the building where people are also renting, but some of the families that we talked to who were renting on the top, because they pay much more, they wanted to move downstairs because it was very hard for them to pay the rent. Sorry, going back and forth. I think this Pepsi shelter is very interesting. It's a very prominent shelter. It's very visible in Saida. They're quite well known, and it also attracts visitors and aid organizations. But still, the assistance to this space is marginal, even though it's more than for many other refugee groups in the city. I also think it's very interesting to look at the numbering outside each of the living spaces. As you can see, I'm pointing to the screen, you can't see it on the far right picture. I took first that this was a marker of their own homemaking and community organization, but of course it was not put up by people themselves. It was numbering put up by an organization who came to assist and needed to label people in some ways as their sort of object for assistance. The flats upstairs have windows, bathrooms, air and comfort, but people would rather live downstairs together with the others, and because it's less costly. The only means of income for most of the people in this shelter was irregular income as casual laborers. For them, as long as they are not allowed to work, there will be limited possibilities of creating a home in Lebanon. Home, however, with lowercase letters. The day-to-day homemaking do take place in Pepsi. People who came to this particular shelter came from the same village in Homs in Syria. They wanted to stay together, and finding this space enabled them to achieve that sense of belonging and community that is also to a large extent embedded in Homs. In home, so now I'm getting towards the end of the talk. So people are finding that staying together in the community with a history from before there is displacement really helps them to pursue not only home in the kind of day-to-day sense, but also home with an uppercase H in terms of that sense of community and familiarity and support and solidarity among themselves. Outside the shelter, an insight in terms of quality of life, in terms of their status, access to work, misrecognition, and this empowerment is, however, still prominent. People have often given up. On one side of the shelter, which lies under a road, the ceilings are crumbling and a block of concrete falls down on their heads sometimes. But people stay, they don't have any other places to go. Another sense of resignation is that only about 20% of the children in this shelter go to school. At 14, most boys work, and many girls already got married. The discourse is that they can only wait for return. As for the institutional restrictions that they meet in Lebanon, although homemaking takes place at lower scales, the institutional recognition and possibility of integration are not present. They're waiting, and they're internalizing a discourse where waiting for return return is the only solution that they can see. So I'll try to wrap it up now. I think it's time to open up for discussion. What I've started to reflect on in this talk, but haven't quite finalized yet, is to engage with a field that takes as its starting point not just the active resistance that people undertake by homemaking in the constrained circumstances where home is not experienced, but people make home, and where people take matters in their own hands to find dwelling spaces, to somehow move on with their lives. I have worked so much with this over the past few years, the way that people make home in these constrained circumstances. But I also have used this talk to reflect on the limits of that homemaking and where we as scholars could potentially contribute to fill a gap and increase our understanding of how home could be further mobilized for unending displacement. Many people in long-term displacement show extreme levels of resilience in their labor to get by. And of course, by making home to get by, as many papers have shown here too, gradually home also become the experience of being in the place of displacement. But this might not be enough. Engaging with the constellations of home to make home possible may take place at different sides of the constellations. We can emphasize in different contexts the different sides of those constellations. They can help us to engage with the political home too. So my starting point and my end point is the way that we can engage with home through social suffering, disempowerment and uncertainty. So to look at the constellations and the recognition together in this way, it means that we can look at home in the lowercase as a strategy which involves finding a roof over one's head, surviving, getting by on your own. Home with an uppercase H is about developing a sense of community. It includes Honneth's spheres of achievement. It is more than getting by. It helps to develop a life in exile. It is the right to a place where you live. I think this home with an uppercase H is where a lot of our research is at the moment. And Kihato and Landau suggest that when national regimes are restrictive, it would be worth working locally to try to ensure rights in a quiet way by gradually and silently include refugees into local life, as instead of sort of advocating at a larger scale, at a national level, which may even contribute to more strict rules about refugee rights. But somehow it is not enough to accept that people integrate locally and find a home and a sense of community in a local place. Because in countries like Lebanon, this is also very problematic. We have seen it for the Palestinians and we're seeing it for the Syrians now. The uppercase home cannot be achieved. People are deprived of making a home fully in that sense. And as researchers, I think we can and should maybe challenge ourselves to work more on how those particular dimensions of home can be unpacked for a mobilizing of home for an unending displacement. And I would really like your feedback on that. Thank you very much.